immediately then they find the body, but they don't find the head. They fish the body out and it's taken off to the morgue. Now you might know a chap who did the post-mortem. Very famous doctor in Cannock called Dr. Butter. He had a menagerie of animals in Cannock at the back of his place, and it was full of wild animals. And he kept them, monkeys and all sorts of things. He'd been in the army and everywhere, but he was the local coroner, and he actually examined the body. And I have a copy of his report, and it's not nice reading at all. What happened to that body was unbelievable, and most of it seems to have happened when she was still alive. He literally beat her to death. He must have, I think what happened was, once he started, he lost it, in modern day terms, and just went mad until she was literally completely pounded and dead. The inquest was set for the Tuesday morning. They didn't hang about in those days, you know. The inquest was set for the Tuesday. The Tuesday afternoon. And Police Constable Baker was sent to Hensford to have one last go at seeing if they could find the head. Now you imagine Constable Baker walking through Hensford with a carrier bag on Tuesday morning, late morning, and something rather heavy in the carrier bag, and you imagine a pedestrian walking and saying, "Hello, what you got there?" Well, he obviously weren't going to show him, because he'd got Elizabeth's head. They finally found the head, and so by the time of the inquest it was actually there for them to see. Obviously he was found guilty. He was then at the assizes, and he was then sent to Birmingham prison. He wasn't sent to Stafford, he was sent to the Birmingham prison, and while he was there he was interviewed by the local psychiatrist. Now I was quite amazed that they had psychiatrists in those days, but apparently they did. And he was sent there and examined. The trial was to begin on July the 4th at Stafford Assizes. Now, there was no way he was going to be able to plead innocent, because he'd already admitted killing her. He'd already shown the body and everything. His only possible defence was insanity. By the way, the prison of Birmingham, I suddenly realised, is Winson Green. Sorry about that, but he was insanity. Now I was quite amazed when I was looking through it to realise that in his early childhood, in the late 1890s, his mother had already had him examined by a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist had turned around and said he wasn't mad or insane, he was just slightly unusual. And he was sent to a school for unusual boys. Now that's going to do a world of good for anybody who's unusual, to be put along with another load of unusual boys. And he spent a couple of years there before he was finally, I suppose, let out, released, whatever word you like, but his mother had him back. Daisy Winfer told stories. One story she told was she was certain there was something wrong with him, because she found him one day in the garden, and what he'd done, he'd rigged up the washing line, and he'd put a scarf round the washing line, stood on a chair, tied the scarf round his neck, and then jumped off the chair, just to see what was going to happen. The line obviously didn't snap, but he was lucky that in fact he hit the ground, because the knot was too long. And she said she's certain there was something slightly wrong with him. Hensford police were also, they knew Gaskin from of old. Stories have it of it, I think one story had him, of riding through Hensford on a pony, pretending he was Roy Rogers or somebody and shooting the town up. So there was a little bit slightly odd about the character. When he was in the war, we come to that medal now, that German medal, he got that by simply, when the shooting all finished at the end of a particular day or whatever, he was quite often seen running around the top, picking up medals and stuff off dead bodies, with bullets flying round him. His two army mates at the time, Woodall and Dawson, said they thought he was loony, but he was determined to get trophies. They also said that in fact the three of them at one point, as tunnellers, were buried alive. And that happened in I think occasionally there was a reverse tunnel coming the other way. The British were digging tunnels under the German lines, and the Germans were digging tunnels under the English lines. And occasionally the bloody things met without realising, or they were less than a foot above one another, above or below one another. And they said they thought that actually did affect him. That in fact he'd got slightly affected, and of course the fact that he wasn't particularly 100% anyway affected him more than it did then. And they were convinced that in fact his behaviour got worse after the incident of being buried alive. However, the prison psychiatrist that interviewed him time and time again was convinced that yes, he was slightly strange, but he wasn't mad. There's a heck of a difference between somebody being mad and somebody being slightly weird. I mean, we can say today that eccentric people are weird, but they're not necessarily mad. What went against him at the trial, really, I suppose, were a couple of things. The main thing being the note that he got written, gone to Birmingham to try and cover up what had happened. That definitely went very much against him. And also the fact that he was sensible enough to be able to hold out against the police and their questioning, and then finally decide he was going to tell them, and it was as if he was still in charge. During the trial, they noticed that in fact he was totally oblivious to what was happening. He was sat there looking at the ceiling, looking, you know, as if it didn't really concern him. He was eventually found guilty. There was going to be no doubt about that. The idea of the insanity plea was the fact that he might just get away with manslaughter as opposed to murder. However, the jury were convinced he had murdered her, and the verdict was murder and that he would hang. Now, surprisingly enough, the last comment the judge made was he didn't care how bad someone was, referring to Elizabeth, no matter how morally evil she was. No one had the right to take another life. No matter how bad the person is, you don't have the right to take their life. and that's why he was committed to hang. Surprisingly enough, Hensford people didn't see it that way. A petition went forward, and remember that at the time Hensford probably only had about 10,000 people living in the whole of the Hensford area, and a good percentage of those would be children. The actual petition got 6,000 signatures against the death penalty. That was obviously weighed up, but unfortunately for Gaskin, it wasn't to prove worthwhile, because he was executed. And I have to always think, worth me noting, he was executed on the day of my birthday. August the 15th, 1919, he was actually executed. So I will never forget the Gaskin case for one thing or another. And in fact, it comes up on my birthday every year, without fail. Okay, folks, if there's anybody wants any questions at all, you can. Can I be naughty and ask for the copies of this back, because I've got to do the same talk about 3 more times this year. So if I could have them back, I don't mind the odd one, you know, but and even naughtier by saying the books at the front I normally sell at £11.99 in the shops. I sell them when I do a talk for £10. I knock £2 off if you want any of them. That's the one with the Gaskin story in, and it's got also the story I think I've done with you before, was the Sarah Westwood case in Burntwood, murdering her husband. The dots on there tell you where the crimes happened. That's a second edition of another one, and there's quite a few I've noticed there: Chase Terrace, Burntwood, Norton Keynes, and so on, in that one. Okay? That's the new book, the very new one. That's come out because of COVID. I had something to do, nothing to do, so I did a book, another book, and that's simply a dictionary of the Hensford area. So if you're arguing with somebody, the answer should be in there. If it isn't, I'm in trouble. Okay, anybody any
questions?
Questions. From the descendants of Lizzie, are there people still in the Hensford area?
Yes, yeah. In fact, I had my grandmother's next door neighbour, her son married one of the Talbot girls, and she's only died, Joyce only died about 10-15 years ago, and she was one of those that always objected, because, you know, they believed that you know, Lizzie had done nothing wrong. She didn't deserve to die. I did have a good argument with her husband once, because I did talk about rumours going round Hensford, and one of the rumours was that Gaskin was seen on the Wednesday night after he'd committed the murder. He was seen in the Uxbridge pub having a drink, and he sang a new song that was out at the time, which was called At the End of a Perfect Day. Now that's a total lie. It's a fabrication, because he never went near the Uxbridge at the night time at all. The song had only just come out. I did track that down. It had only just come out the same year. But he certainly did not go in the Uxbridge and sing that song. And he did go in the Uxbridge in the morning, but he wouldn't have sung At the End of a Perfect Day. But these are rumours. I had a real good argument with that lady's husband, Fred, who told me I was talking a load of rubbish. And I just said, well, you've just got a bloody big interest in the whole thing, haven't you? Your wife actually is a member of the family. And we decided to part company happily when I said that, because he wasn't having it. He was convinced, you know, he was right. Anyone else at all?
So Lizzie's mother, she brought up the children, the 3 children?
No, most of the children went into homes, into a care home in Ridgefield. She didn't bring the children up at all. Because Monty wouldn't have anything. The Monty who had the last one with her wouldn't have anything to do with it. He didn't want to know. So I think they all 3 of them ended up in homes. There is a case actually that's the big argument, but I've never been able to prove it, that she actually had another one. She actually had 4 illegitimate children, but I've only got down to 3 for definite. But they all went into a home a children's home in Litchfield. Yeah.
What about the Gaskin? The brother, because
Strangely enough, nothing's heard of about them after. I think they just kept a very low profile. The father was never there. Well, the father actually had died at work a couple of years before this whole thing happened. He had a heart attack while he was at work and died. The dad did. The mother, I think, successfully cut herself off and wouldn't talk about the whole thing at all. And the brother was actually a step-brother. And so he actually said that it was nothing to do with him. Gaskin wasn't part of his family. So they didn't literally want to. There's a lovely book actually. I only deal with the murder itself, the crime and everything else. But there's a book purely on Gaskin and the family, written by Paul Bedford, a history teacher, and it's simply called Gaskin. Now, I don't know if it's still in print. The last time the museum sort of wanted copies, I think they actually got in touch with me and said, do you know where he lives? And has he got any copies of the book? And I said, as far as I know, no. But it's a case of, would he be able to reprint the book? You know. Anyone else at all? Anyone? Not very nice story.
How competent was his defence?
How come?
How competent was his defence?
Very. But they realised, you know, it was going to be a waste of time trying to defend that he hadn't killed her. So they went on the attack of, you know, was he innocent, was he mad, or was he whatever. But I don't think he could claim that the defence wasn't helpful or wasn't good. I think they were as good as any defence was going to likely to be.
Was there a suggestion of what we nowadays call post-traumatic stress disorder?
I suppose nowadays you might be able to sort of get away with that and perhaps put that in because of the accident with the tunnelling and that. You might be able to get away because the wonderful article written, somebody lent me a book, I can't remember the name of the book now. Now I don't know if I've printed I've got the article with me, I may have left it at home. Apparently they did an article on people returning from the First World War, and apparently the crime rate went up quite dramatically with people who got home and couldn't, you know, we would now call it post-traumatic stress. In the 1914, they didn't know what, 18, they didn't know what it was. All they knew was these men had come home and were quite violent to their wives. And there were, in fact, 3 or 4 murders at the same time of ex-army men who'd come out and murdered their wives. Now, whether or not, I suppose we would say today post-traumatic stress. You know, it's one of those things that does happen. Whereas in those days, it was a case of get on with it, kid. You know, it's finished, forget it. The fact you're having nightmares and can't sleep and God knows what, doesn't matter. You'll eventually get over it, you know. I always have to laugh. A friend of mine used to say, talk about depression, we weren't wealthy enough to be depressed. And it does make you think, you know, in those days, there's no such thing as depression. I mean, I think we do, dare I say, I think we play that card too often nowadays. Everything on the news, you're thinking, no, not again. You know, poor kids at school, 5-year-olds, they're suffering from mental stress. Of course you bloody are, you're at school. You know, you're meant to be slightly puzzled and slightly sort of question and that. You know, it's not a case of, you know, everything in life is going to be goody, goody, goody. And I think we've lost a little of the plot in that respect. We think everything ought to be good. Life ain't like that. Life has its ups and turns. I always say, what makes the good things good are the bad things that were bad. If you think about that, that's quite philosophical, really. I better shut up.
I mean, sorry, go on.
You said he was questioned by the police and seemed to hold out for a couple of days. Is there any reason he changed his mind, or did they?
No one ever knows why he suddenly changed his mind. He just, I don't know. Even Paul Bedford in his book doesn't give an answer to that question. He just suddenly decided he'd had enough of the questioning and he was going to say, all right, fair enough. You know, I'll show you where the body is.
How long was he questioned then?
It'd probably be the whole of the Saturday and the Sunday morning.
Right. But they had the same limit, did they, on how long people could be?
In those days, there was no limit.
Oh, right.
You know, not like today where you know, you've got to go to court and say, can we keep them for 20 days or can we keep them for 21 days? And then after that, you've either got to let them go or apply again for more. I think it's 7 days to start with, isn't it? And then you apply for
before they're charged.
Yeah, and then 48 hours before they're charged, and then you've got 7 days, and then you've got an extension to 21 days. In those days, there was nothing. They could have you as long as they wanted.
It's more than terrorism, though, isn't it? I think that's extent.
It's yeah.
Is Mrs. Gaskin buried locally? Was she buried locally?
Elizabeth, yes, yeah, she's. I've never found the grave, but I presume she was buried in St Peter's, in Hensford.
It's asked for somebody to look up.
Yeah.
I know.
I mean, that's a funeral that happens there, and that's Hensford High Street. And Stacey's, who I've used as funeral directors, they were the ones that had the funeral. They ran the funeral. And that is Hensford High Street as it was in 1919. I presume she was buried at St Peter's, because that would be the obvious place to bury her. Because she wasn't cremated. But I've never actually, funny enough, you know, you say that, I've never actually looked for the grave, but I'm presuming it won't be, because St Peter's graveyard was, at one point, was a real mess. It was up and down. My grandmother's buried there, and we could never find her. We knew roughly where the grave was, but there was so much of the pulling of the mines and one thing or another that they had to level the graveyard off at times, and almost restart the whole thing. Same with the church I go to, the Catholic Church, as part of that, where the mines pulled it all to bits, and so some of the graves were lost.
There is somebody that posts on Hensford Memories about going to St Peter's churchyard and finding the old gravestones.
Yes, there's a woman that actually does that, isn't it? She does quite a bit of work. I can't remember her name now. She does quite a bit of work on the graves there, and every now and again on the old Hensford site, she'll put that this is what she's found at such and such a grave, and all the information that she's found of the person. But no one's ever done Elizabeth Gaskin, and it's not in Paul Bedford's book either. as to if the grave is still there.
What about Gaskin? Was he hung at Winton Green?
He was hanged at Winston Green, yes, yeah. And
So would he have been buried?
typical case there, they actually buried him in the actual prison. And if the prison graveyard wasn't big enough, what they tended to do was they would, as soon as they buried a body, they covered it in lime. So it would disintegrate the body quite quickly. And then they could bury others on top after. So there's no way you'll get to, Gaskin will be there. Same with Palmer. He was buried at Stafford. But as soon as they buried him, it went. The lime went on top of the body to get the body to disintegrate quicker. Yeah. Anyone else at all?
Are there no ghost stories about her wandering around without her head?
Funny enough, no. The only story we have as kids, as I say, frightening one another to death as you walk through that woods. And we used to quite frequently walk through. You know how kids are. You frighten one of them to death, and the next week you do the same again. To have another, see if you can be just as frightened the next week. But yeah, there are no actual ghost stories, which is quite surprising. That in fact, so it's all disappeared now. The gasometer's gone. The plantation is still there, but of course the house is gone. The museum, the pit is no longer a pit, it's the museum. And the museum have never mentioned any stories that they've heard. So no, I don't think I've heard any stories about ghosts or whatever. It's unusual because you'll always get somebody who'll find a ghost story about something. We had one tonight about Ghost Row in Hensford. And that, there's always somebody who'll find there's a ghost somewhere, and you think, oh, who's made that one up now? How many bells has that one got on to pull?
It's like the song about Anne Boleyn, isn't it, with her head tucked underneath
Oh yeah,
her
the
arm.
head tucked underneath her arm, yes. And yes, she walks the bloody tower. I don't mind saying that because I can swear legally then.
Well, I hope everybody's going to sleep well tonight after that. Thank you very much, Anthony.
Okay, yeah.
You might be a bit rusty, but it doesn't show. So thank you very much. A round of applause.